Owner has no idea why customers leave at 9 p.m. Going undercover reveals the night shift secret. The Mirage Crescent was the kind of hotel that made people feel like they'd arrived somewhere important. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from vaulted ceilings. The marble floors reflected everything: the cocktail glasses, the designer shoes, the quiet confidence of people who never checked price tags. A night at the Mirage Crescent cost more than most people's monthly rent, and guests paid it happily because the experience was supposed to be flawless. Supposed to be. Roman Calloway stood on the sidewalk across the street at 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, watching his hotel through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a stranger. He was 31 years old, had inherited the property 2 years ago after his father's death, and had spent every waking hour since then trying to turn it into something his father would have been proud of. He'd upgraded the rooms, hired a Michelin-starred chef, replaced the entire bar program with a curated cocktail menu that got written up in 3 national magazines. None of it mattered if people kept running out the front door every single night at 9 o'clock. He watched the timestamp on his phone tick toward 9 p.m. and felt his jaw tighten. It started small, the way disasters usually do. A woman in a red dress set down her wine glass mid-sip. A man in a charcoal suit folded his napkin slowly, like he was trying not to make it obvious. Then a couple near the window stood up together without exchanging a single word, as if they'd rehearsed it. Within 4 minutes, the lounge that had been buzzing with conversation was nearly empty. Servers stood frozen between tables, holding plates of food that nobody had asked to take away. Roman had seen this happen on security footage 17 times in the past 3 weeks. Watching it live was somehow worse. He crossed the street and walked in through the side entrance. Mr. Calloway, his operations manager, Sandra, appeared from around a corner with the specific expression of someone who had been hoping to avoid him. "I didn't know you were coming tonight. That was the point," he said. He walked through the lounge slowly. The bartender, a young guy named Felix, was wiping down the counter with mechanical focus, not making eye contact. 2 servers were clearing the abandoned tables in near silence. The chef had already retreated to the kitchen. Everyone was moving like the building might suddenly ask them a question they didn't want to answer. Roman sat at the bar. "What happened?" Felix kept wiping the same section of counter. "Slow night. 53 guests were seated at 8:50. I watched them leave from across the street." Roman placed his phone on the bar screen up. "I have footage." Felix said nothing. Roman had already pulled the internal security logs before coming tonight. The cameras in the east hallway cut out every single night between 9:02 and 9:17 p.m. Not glitched. Not malfunctioned. Cut. Someone was doing it manually, which meant someone on his staff was involved, and had been involved long enough that they'd gotten comfortable. That made it worse. He left without pushing further. Not because he'd given up, because he'd already made a decision on the drive over. 3 days later, Roman Calloway walked back into the Mirage Crescent wearing a baseball cap, a plain black shirt, and a name tag that said, Ray. He'd called a staffing agency using a secondary number, requested a placement for a temporary night bartender, and arranged it through Sandra's assistant, someone junior enough not to recognize the trap. His real identity stayed out of every piece of paperwork. To the night crew, he was Ray Morales, filling in for someone on medical leave. The kitchen staff barely glanced at him. The evening supervisor, a tall woman named Priya, shook his hand and pointed him toward the bar setup with the brisk efficiency of someone who had more important things to worry about. That was fine. Invisible was exactly what Roman needed to be. The first few hours were ordinary. Guests ordered. He poured. He smiled at the right moments, and stayed quiet the rest of the time, which was apparently all it took to convince people you'd been doing a job for years. By 8:30, the lounge was full again, the usual crowd, beautiful and loud and completely unaware that the man making their old fashions owned the building they were sitting in. Then the clock moved toward 9. Roman noticed it first in the staff. The easy rhythm of the shift changed. Servers started checking the hallway. Priya disappeared into the back office and came out looking deliberately calm, the way people look when they've just talked themselves out of something. Felix, working tonight too, began moving more slowly, like he was running out the clock. At 8:58, a sound drifted down from somewhere above them. Roman almost missed it under the noise of the lounge. But then a couple near the entrance went quiet. Then the group by the window. The sound wasn't loud, it was the opposite of loud, which made it impossible to ignore. It was a voice. A woman's voice coming from somewhere upstairs, singing something low and slow and achingly beautiful. Roman didn't recognize the song. But something about the voice made his chest feel strange, like hearing a sound you'd forgotten you'd been waiting for your whole life. Around him, guests were standing up. Not in a panic. Not in confusion. Quietly, almost reverently, like they'd been asked to leave somewhere sacred. Within 3 minutes, the lounge was emptying again. And this time, Roman was on the inside watching it happen. He looked up at the ceiling. Then he looked at Felix. Felix was looking at the ceiling too, but not with confusion. With something that looked unmistakably like love. Roman set down the glass in his hand very carefully. Room 309. He'd seen it in the security footage, always in the background, always the same floor. He didn't know what was up there yet. But he was going to find out, even if every single person in this building was determined to stop him. Roman waited. That was the hardest part, standing behind the bar, pouring drinks for the few guests who'd wandered back in after the voice stopped, pretending he hadn't just watched an entire lounge empty itself for a ghost. He smiled when people ordered. He wiped the counter when it didn't need wiping. He did everything a bartender named Ray Morales would do while Roman Calloway's mind was 3 floors above him, already inside room 309. At 10:40 p.m., he got his opening. The elderly bellman, a small, deliberate man named George who moved like every step was a decision, slipped out from the service corridor carrying a wooden tray. On it sat a ceramic teapot, a small glass of water, and 2 orange prescription bottles arranged neatly beside a folded cloth napkin. It wasn't a room service order. There was no ticket, no receipt, no record of it anywhere. Roman had checked the system during his break. George didn't take the main elevator. He took the staff elevator at the far end of the east corridor, the same corridor where the cameras cut out every night at 9:02. Roman gave him a 2-minute head start. Then he followed. The 3rd floor was different from the rest of the hotel. Quieter in a way that felt intentional, like sound itself had been asked to keep its distance. The carpet was the same deep burgundy as the floors below, but up here it felt heavier somehow, more serious. Most of the rooms had their lights off. Guests on this floor were apparently either asleep early or not there at all. Room 309 sat at the far end of the corridor, past a linen cart someone had left parked against the wall. A thin line of warm amber light spilled from beneath the door. Roman slowed as he approached, staying close to the wall, watching George knock twice in a specific pattern, short, long, before the door opened just enough to let him inside. Roman moved forward until he was close enough to see through the gap before it closed. The room had been transformed into something that didn't belong in a hotel. Dark curtains blocked the windows completely. A standing lamp in the corner threw honey-colored light across the walls, which were lined with stacks of vinyl records and paper sleeves, organized with the kind of care that took years. An oxygen concentrator hummed softly near the bed. Sheet music covered the small writing desk, handwritten, covered in pencil marks and crossed-out notes. And in the center of all of it, seated in an armchair with a blanket across her lap, was an old woman. She was small and sharp-featured, with silver hair pinned back simply and hands that rested in her lap with the patience of someone who had learned to be still. Even from the doorway, even in the dim light, there was something about her presence that made the room feel like it belonged to her entirely, like the hotel had simply grown up around her. She was singing again. Not performing. Not projecting. Just singing softly to herself while George poured tea beside her, the way someone might hum while reading, unconsciously, as if the music leaked out of her without permission. It was a jazz standard Roman half recognized, something from a different era, but in her voice it sounded like it had been written specifically for this moment, this room, this quiet. Roman stood frozen in the corridor, one hand against the doorframe. He knew he should leave. He knew if anyone came out of a room and saw a bartender standing alone in the hallway staring at a guest's door, the cover was finished. But his feet didn't move, because the voice was doing something to the air around him that he couldn't explain and didn't want to interrupt. Then a hand closed hard around his shoulder from behind. Walk. Now. The night manager, a broad-shouldered man named Hector who Roman had never formally met but recognized from staff files, steered him firmly away from the door and down the corridor without another word. His grip was professional and absolute, the kind that said I've done this before. He pushed Roman into the stairwell and let the door close behind them. You're the new bartender. It wasn't a question. I got lost looking for the ice machine, Roman said. Hector looked at him for a long moment with the flat patience of someone who had heard every version of that sentence. The ice machine is in the basement. The third floor is not the basement. You don't come up here again. Not for any reason. You understand me? Who is she? I guessed. Guests don't get prescription medicine delivered on an unlocked tray. Something shifted in Hector's face, just briefly, a tightening around the eyes, before the professional calm slid back into place. Go back to the bar, Ray. Finish your shift. He turned to leave. She said my name? Hector stopped. Roman kept his voice even. Right before the door closed. She looked straight at me and said Calloway. I've never met that woman in my life. I didn't introduce myself. My name tag says Ray. He paused. So I'll ask again. Who is she? The stairwell was very quiet. Hector turned back slowly, and for the first time, the careful blankness on his face cracked, just enough to show what was underneath it. Not guilt. Not fear. Something older and more complicated than either of those things. Her name, he said quietly, is Evelyn Hart. Roman felt the name land somewhere in the back of his memory, distant and important, like a book title he'd seen once as a child on his father's shelf. She's been gone for 30 years, he said slowly. Hector looked at him with tired, certain eyes. She's been somewhere, he said. Just not anywhere people could find her. Roman didn't sleep that night. He sat in his car in the hotel parking garage until 3 a.m., phone in hand, searching a name he hadn't thought about in years. Evelyn Hart. The results came back immediately, hundreds of them, archived newspaper articles, old album covers, grainy concert photographs from the 1970s and 80s. A woman in a spotlight, mouth open mid-note, one hand raised toward an audience that was clearly completely undone by whatever she was giving them. She had been extraordinary. That much was obvious even through a phone screen at 3 in the morning. 6 Grammy nominations. 4 #1 jazz albums. A voice that critics had compared to a force of nature, not because it was loud, but because it moved things. Sold-out concerts across every major American city. Magazine covers. A Kennedy Center performance in 1987 that people who were there still talked about like a religious experience. And then, in 1994, nothing. No farewell tour. No announcement. No explanation. Evelyn Hart had simply stepped off the edge of public life and disappeared so completely that the music industry eventually stopped looking for her and started mourning her instead. Some assumed she'd died quietly somewhere. Others believed she'd lost her mind. The Wikipedia page listed her status with a single brutal word, whereabouts unknown, as if she were a missing ship rather than a human being. Roman stared at that phrase for a long time. Then he drove home, changed his clothes, and went straight to the hotel archives. The records room was in the basement, behind the maintenance corridor, and nobody used it anymore. Everything was technically digitized, but Roman's father had been old-fashioned about paper, believed that digital files disappeared too easily, that a document you could hold in your hands was harder to erase. Roman had always found that philosophy mildly inconvenient until this particular morning, when he pulled open a filing cabinet and found exactly what he needed. Guest registration logs. 25 years of them. He started with the current file and worked backward. It took him 90 minutes to find the first alias. A Margaret Ellis registered to room 309 18 months ago. Listed occupation: retired. Emergency contact: none. Before that, a Ruth Chambers in a Chicago property his father had briefly co-owned in 2009. Before that, a Clara Simmons in a New Orleans boutique hotel whose manager had once worked for his father. The names changed every time. The room numbers were always odd. The stays were always long, months, sometimes close to a year. And every single property had one thing in common. The staff protected her. Not officially. Not on paper. But in the margins of the logs, Roman found small handwritten notations that meant nothing to an outsider. A star next to a room number, a circled initial, a date with no corresponding checkout. A quiet language developed over decades between people who had decided, without any formal agreement, that this woman deserved to be left alone. Roman sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. His father's handwriting was in 3 of the logs. He flew to Los Angeles that afternoon. The retired pianist's name was Arthur Sims, and he lived in a small house in Culver City filled with the specific clutter of a life spent making music, stacks of sheet music, a keyboard pushed against one wall, framed concert posters layered 3 deep in places where the walls had run out of room. He was in his late 70s, moved carefully, and looked at Roman for a long moment before opening the door all the way. "You have your father's eyes," Arthur said. "I wondered when one of you Callaways would finally show up." They sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them, and Arthur talked. He had played piano for Evelyn for 6 years in the 1980s, traveled with her on 3 world tours, and watched from the inside as Victor Dane, her producer, her manager, the man who controlled her contract, her schedule, her finances, and eventually her entire existence, systematically dismantled every part of her that didn't serve him directly. "He wasn't just controlling," Arthur said, choosing the word carefully. "He was surgical about it. He isolated her from other musicians first. Then her friends. Then her family. By the time most people noticed something was wrong, there was nobody left around her who was allowed to say it out loud. Victor Dane owned her masters. Every song she had ever recorded, the royalties, the licensing rights, everything, was locked inside contracts so aggressively written that 3 separate entertainment lawyers had told Evelyn it would take a decade of litigation to untangle them. Litigation Dane had more than enough money to outlast. "She didn't disappear because she broke down," Arthur said quietly. "She disappeared because disappearing was the only move he hadn't already taken away from her." Roman wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "My father. How was he involved?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. "Your father met Evelyn through a mutual friend in 1993. He was running his first hotel property in Chicago at the time. When she finally ran, and I mean ran, middle of the night, one bag, he gave her a room and told his staff she was a relative visiting from out of town." He paused. "That was the beginning of all of it. Other hotel people your father trusted got brought in over the years. It became its own quiet network." Roman stared at the table. His father had never mentioned any of this. Not once in 31 years. "He protected her for decades," Roman said. "And never told me." "He protected you too," Arthur said simply. "Knowing makes you a target. Your father understood that better than anyone." Roman drove back to the airport in silence. He now understood why Evelyn had recognized his name. He understood the network, the aliases, the loyal staff, the cut camera feeds. What he didn't understand yet was why, after 25 years of perfect silence, something had suddenly changed. He was about to find out it wasn't something. It was someone. Roman landed back in Las Vegas at 9 p.m. He was still in the cab when Sandra called. "There's a woman here," she said, keeping her voice low in the way people do when the subject of the conversation is standing close enough to hear. "She's been talking to staff members all evening. Says she's writing a travel feature on luxury hotels. But she's been asking very specific questions about long-term guests, and she keeps circling back to the 3rd floor. Roman's hand tightened around the phone. Don't let anyone say anything. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He was there in 8. He spotted her immediately from across the lobby, not because she was loud or obvious, but because she was the opposite. Claire Bennett was the kind of person who had learned to disappear inside a room while still seeing everything in it. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back practically, a reporter's notebook tucked under one arm and a coffee cup in her other hand like props she'd chosen to make herself look casual. She was talking to one of the front desk clerks with the easy, unhurried manner of someone who had all the time in the world and absolutely did not. Roman watched her for a few minutes before approaching. She was good. She let the clerk talk first, asked follow-up questions that sounded like natural curiosity, and never once wrote anything down while she was listening, only after, when the clerk's attention drifted somewhere else. A professional habit. She trained herself not to make people feel interviewed. He walked over and stood beside her at the desk until the clerk excused himself. Travel feature, Roman said. Which publication? Claire turned without flinching, which told him she'd already clocked him crossing the lobby. The kind that takes a while to come out, she said pleasantly. Are you the manager? Something like that. She smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. Then you'll know that talking to guests and staff in a public lobby isn't something that requires anyone's permission. No, Roman agreed. But asking my staff specifically about the third floor while pretending to write about thread counts does. That landed. She covered it quickly, but he saw it, a small recalibration behind her eyes, the slight adjustment of someone who had just decided to change strategy. Can we talk somewhere private? She said. They sat in the empty hotel restaurant after closing, a single light on above them, 2 waters on the table that neither of them touched. Roman had done a fast search on his phone in the elevator. Claire Bennett, investigative journalist, had bylines in 4 national outlets over the past decade. Labor abuse in fashion supply chains. A pharmaceutical whistleblower story that triggered a federal investigation. A long-form piece on a disgraced sports agent that had won 2 awards. She wasn't writing a travel feature. She had never written a travel feature in her life. Victor Dane, she said, placing a thin folder on the table between them. That's what I'm actually here about. Roman said nothing and let her continue. Dane is 78 years old and his liver is failing. Doctors have given him somewhere between 4 and 8 months. She opened the folder. Inside were photographs, financial documents, and printed email chains with large sections highlighted in yellow. In the past 6 weeks, his legal team has filed 17 motions across 4 states trying to consolidate the master recording rights to artists he signed between 1979 and 1998. Most of those artists are either dead, too broke to fight back, or too afraid. She paused. One of them isn't dead. And Dane knows it. You've been tracking Evelyn, Roman said. I've been tracking Dane. Evelyn is where his trail keeps leading. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not trying to expose her. I want to expose him. But to do that properly, I need documentation of what he did to her specifically. Contracts, coercion, threats. The kind of evidence that doesn't just make a good story but actually holds up. She looked at him steadily. And I think you've just spent the last 48 hours figuring out the same thing I have. Roman studied her face. She was telling the truth, or at least a version of it that was close enough to truth that the difference didn't matter yet. You said Dane knows she's alive, he said. How? Claire's expression shifted into something harder. Because someone in one of the hotels talked. About 8 weeks ago, in New Orleans. Dane's people have been moving closer ever since, city by city. She closed the folder. She ran to Las Vegas because it was the next name on your father's list. But they're already here, Roman. He went still. She'd used his real name. She watched him register it and didn't apologize. I've known who you were since this morning. I'm not here to play games. I'm here because Dane's sons have had 2 private investigators parked outside this hotel for the past 4 days, and whoever is protecting that woman upstairs is running out of time whether they know it or not. Roman looked at the folder on the table. Then at Claire. Every instinct he had about people told him two contradictory things simultaneously: that she was hiding something personal about this story, and that she was also completely sincere about stopping Dane. Both could be true. In his experience, both usually were. "My mother," Claire said quietly, before he could ask. "She sang backup for Dane's label in the late 80s. She spent 11 years trying to get out of her contract." She looked down at the folder for just a moment. "She didn't make it out healthy." The restaurant was very quiet. Roman picked up the folder. "We start with the paper trail," he said. "Hotel ledgers, train records, payroll across every property. If Dane's team is building a case, we need to understand it before they finish building it." Claire nodded once, already pulling out her notebook. Neither of them noticed the lobby camera in the corner had been angled, very slightly, very deliberately, toward the restaurant window. Someone was already watching. The paper trail took them 3 days. Roman pulled every hotel record he had access to while Claire worked her own sources. A retired travel agent in Chicago who had booked under Evelyn's aliases for years. A former payroll clerk in New Orleans who remembered a name appearing on maintenance rosters that didn't match any actual maintenance work. They spread everything across Roman's private office, covering the desk, the floor, the window ledge, building a map of Evelyn's movements across 25 years that looked less like a fugitive's escape route and more like a carefully managed life. Someone had been coordinating it all along. Not Roman's father alone. He had started it, built the foundation, brought in the first few trusted properties. But the network had kept running after his death 2 years ago with a precision that required someone actively managing it. Rerouting Evelyn when a city got too risky. Signaling staff at the next property before she arrived. Keeping the aliases clean and the paper trail deliberately messy. Roman had assumed it was Hector. He was wrong. It was Claire who found it first, buried inside a payroll cross-reference she'd been staring at for so long the numbers had started blurring. She set her pen down slowly and pushed the sheet across the desk toward Roman without saying anything. He looked at it. A maintenance worker listed across 4 different hotel properties over 11 years. Different job titles: janitor, facilities technician, building supervisor, groundskeeper. Different cities. But the same employee ID number, which should have been impossible unless someone with system access had deliberately linked the accounts. The name on the file was Daniel Reyes. Roman looked up. "He works here. Basement level," Claire said. "Has been for 7 months." Roman left the office without his jacket. He found Daniel in the lowest sublevel of the building, in the mechanical room behind the boiler system, replacing a section of pipe with the focused quiet of a man who preferred work to conversation. He was in his mid-40s, lean and careful in his movements, with close-cut gray at his temples that made him look older than he probably was. He didn't look up when Roman came in. "I've been expecting someone to find me eventually," Daniel said, reaching for a wrench. "Took longer than I thought." Roman stood near the doorway. "You've been coordinating the network since my father died. Someone had to. You could have called me. Told me what was happening in my own hotel." Daniel set the wrench down and finally looked at him. His eyes were steady and completely unreadable. The eyes of someone who had decided a long time ago that most people weren't worth the energy of an emotional reaction. "I didn't know if you could be trusted. Your father trusted very few people with the full picture. I wasn't going to hand it to his son just because of a last name." Roman pulled a stool from against the wall and sat down, which seemed to mildly surprise Daniel. "Tell me the full picture then." For a long moment Daniel said nothing. Then he sat down too, on an overturned crate, forearms resting on his knees. "Evelyn Hart is my mother," he said. The boiler hummed between them. Roman had suspected it for approximately 48 hours, but hearing it stated plainly still hit differently than he expected. He kept his face still and let Daniel continue at his own pace. "She was 26 when she had me. Victor Dane told her a child would end her career before it properly started, that she'd lose her contract, her momentum, everything she'd worked for." Daniel's voice was flat, almost clinical, like he was reading from a report about someone else's life. "She believed him. She was terrified of him by that point. Most people around her were. He paused. She gave me to her cousin's family in Baton Rouge. They were good people. They told me the truth when I was 16-inch. And then? Roman asked quietly. And then I spent 4 years being furious. Something moved briefly across Daniel's face and was gone. After that I started looking for her. Took another 3 years to find her. By then she'd already been running for almost a decade. I watched from a distance for a while before she knew I was there. She knows now? She's known for 6 years. We don't. He stopped. Started again. We don't have the kind of relationship where things are fixed just because they're out in the open. She knows what she did. I know why she did it. Neither of those things makes it simple. Roman thought about his own father, about the logs in the archive room with the handwriting he recognized. About all the things a parent decides to carry alone because they believe it protects someone. But you still protect her, Roman said. She's still my mother. Daniel said it without warmth and without bitterness, just the plain weight of a fact he'd long stopped trying to argue with. Dane threatened her for years, told her if she ever resurfaced publicly, he'd find me and use me to get to her. That's why she stayed hidden. Not just for herself. The room felt smaller suddenly. Roman leaned forward. Dane's people are already outside this building. His sons found her, Daniel. We have maybe days before this stops being manageable. For the first time, something cracked in Daniel's composure. Not much, just enough. His jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to the floor for a moment. I know, he said. I've been watching them watch us. Then we need to move her. Tonight, if possible. Daniel nodded slowly. Then, almost to himself, so quietly Roman nearly missed it. She asked about you, you know. After Hector told her a Callaway had found the floor. He looked up. She said your father would have done the same thing. Roman stood and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. He walked back toward the elevator with the weight of an inherited responsibility settling across his shoulders like it had always belonged there, like his father had simply been keeping it warm. They moved her on a Wednesday at 2 a.m. No announcement. No paper trail. Roman booked the destination under a corporate entity his father had set up years ago for exactly this kind of necessity. A shell name attached to a real address, clean enough to pass a casual search, meaningless enough to stop a thorough one. Claire drove the first leg in a rental car she'd paid for in cash. Daniel rode in the back with Evelyn, the oxygen equipment folded into 2 bags at his feet, the vinyl records left behind because there was no room and because Evelyn had told him, quietly, that the music was in her head anyway. Roman followed in his own car, watching the mirrors. Nobody followed. Not that night. The property outside Santa Fe had been on his father's list, a small historic hotel called the Copper Lantern, built in the 1920s, tucked into the high desert with the kind of deep, structural quiet that cities never managed regardless of how hard they tried. The owner was a woman in her 60s named Margaret, who had worked briefly at one of his father's Chicago properties in the 90s and had been on the network's contact list ever since. She met them in the parking lot at dawn with room keys already in her hand and no questions on her face. Roman liked her immediately. They settled Evelyn into a ground-floor room with large windows facing the desert. She sat in the chair they positioned near the window and looked out at the pale morning light spreading across the sand and scrub brush, and for a while nobody spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had collectively been holding their breath for days and were only just remembering how to exhale. Victor always hated the desert, Evelyn said eventually, to nobody in particular. Too much sky. He liked to feel like the biggest thing in the room. Claire glanced at Roman. Roman looked at Evelyn. Tell me about him, he said. Not as an interrogation. As an invitation. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. In the morning light, she looked both older and somehow more vivid than she did in the dim amber of room 309, like the sun was refusing to be polite about what time had done. But her eyes were sharp and completely present. Victor Dane was the most charming man I'd ever met when I was 22 years old and walking into his office with a demo tape and no idea what I was doing, she said. He had a way of making you feel like he'd been waiting specifically for you. Like you were the answer to something he'd been searching for. She paused. That's the most dangerous kind of person. The ones who make you feel chosen. She told them the rest slowly, in pieces, the way you dismantle something that was built to hurt you, carefully, making sure each piece is fully separate before you put it down. The contracts had come first. Standard industry language on the surface, catastrophic in the details, rights assignments buried in subclauses, renewal options that locked automatically, royalty structures that ensured she saw almost nothing from album sales while Dane's company collected everything. By the time she understood what she'd signed, she was 3 albums deep and legally entangled in ways that would have taken years and a small fortune to escape. Then came the control. Tour schedules that left no room for outside relationships. Band members quietly replaced with Dane's preferred choices. Her mail screened. Her phone calls monitored. A personal assistant who reported everything back to him and was replaced the moment Evelyn realized it and said so. I tried leaving in 1991, she said. I had a lawyer. I had documentation. I had 2 other artists willing to corroborate what was happening. Her voice stayed even, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap. Within 6 weeks, the lawyer dropped my case citing a conflict of interest. The documentation disappeared from my apartment during a break-in that the police called inconclusive. The other artists stopped returning my calls. She looked out at the desert. That was when I understood the actual size of what I was dealing with. The room was very still. The recordings? Claire said gently. The unreleased ones. Evelyn nodded slowly. I made them between 1992 and 1994. Secretly, in a studio in New Jersey owned by a sound engineer who owed me a favor and asked nothing in return. 41 songs. The best work I ever did, because for the first time in years nobody was standing behind me telling me what the work was supposed to sound like. She paused. Victor found out about the sessions but never found the masters. That's partly why he's still looking. A dying man and his legacy. Her voice carried something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite pity, something colder than both. Roman's phone buzzed. He looked down. A message from Hector, back in Las Vegas, 3 words and a photograph. They went inside. The photograph was a security still from the hotel. 2 men in the corridor of the 3rd floor, standing outside room 309. One of them was trying the door handle. The timestamp read 4 hours ago. Roman turned the phone so Claire could see. Her face went carefully blank in the way it did when she was absorbing something bad and deciding how to respond to it. They'll know she's gone, Daniel said from the corner, where he'd been sitting so quietly Roman had half forgotten he was there. Which means they'll start looking. Then we stop reacting, Roman said. He set the phone down on the windowsill and looked at Evelyn. You've been running for 30 years. I think it's time to stop. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment with those sharp, tired eyes. Then something shifted in her face, something that had been braced for a very long time slowly, carefully releasing. I've been thinking the same thing, she said quietly. I just needed someone else to say it first. Outside, the desert sun climbed higher, enormous and indifferent, flooding the room with the kind of light that left nowhere left to hide. Which was, Roman realized, exactly the point. The idea started as a conversation and became a plan within 48 hours. Not because they rushed it, because once Evelyn decided something, the decision had a quality of finality that made hesitation feel irrelevant. Roman had noticed it in the desert room at the Copper Lantern. The moment she said she was done running, something in her posture changed permanently. Her spine straightened. Her voice, already remarkable, lost the careful softness she'd been using for years like a disguise and became something fuller and more dangerous. She wasn't hiding anymore. And a woman like Evelyn Hart who wasn't hiding was an entirely different force of nature. Claire made the first call to New Orleans, a former session musician named Percy who had played trumpet on Evelyn's third album and had spent 30 years telling anyone who would listen that the music industry had committed a crime by letting her disappear. Percy cried for approximately 90 seconds on the phone and then started making calls of his own. Within 24 hours he had confirmed 7 musicians. Within 48 he had 12, flying in from 4 different cities, asking nothing about payment. Roman handled the venue. The Marichal Room was a concert hall buried inside a historic building in the French Quarter, small by stadium standards, intimate by design, with acoustics so precise that sound engineers occasionally visited just to stand inside it and listen to the room breathe. The owner had operated on the edge of financial ruin for years and was initially resistant until Roman explained, without full details, that the event would be recorded professionally and live-streamed to an audience that Claire's media contacts estimated in the hundreds of thousands. The owner agreed within the hour. They kept the location secret until 36 hours before. Claire seeded the information carefully, not an announcement, not a press release, but a single sentence posted across 3 music journalism accounts with large followings. Evelyn Hart is alive. New Orleans. Friday night. No venue. No time. Just a name, dropped into the internet like a stone into still water. The ripples were immediate and enormous. By the following morning it was the most searched name in the country. News outlets called it a hoax. Fan accounts called it a miracle. Music historians began writing think pieces before they had any confirmed facts. Someone uploaded a 30-year-old concert clip that reached 4 million views overnight. The hunger for her, which had apparently never disappeared, only gone dormant, surfaced with a force that surprised everyone except Percy, who had always known it was there. "People don't forget a voice like that," he told Roman over the phone. "They just run out of places to put it." The complications arrived on Thursday morning. Roman was reviewing the live stream setup with the venue's technical team when Daniel called. "Dane's legal team filed an emergency injunction 2 hours ago," Daniel said. "They're claiming the performance constitutes unauthorized use of Evelyn's recordings under the 1993 contract. They're targeting the venue, the live stream platform, and your production company." "The performance is live," Roman said. "She'll be singing original unreleased material. Nothing covered under the existing contracts. They know that. The injunction is designed to create enough legal confusion that the venue pulls out before anyone can clarify." Daniel paused. "And Roman, someone cut the power junction to the Marichal building an hour ago. City crews say it was vandalism. Could be coincidence." "It was not coincidence." Roman called Margaret in Santa Fe. She confirmed 2 men had been seen driving past the Copper Lantern twice that morning. Evelyn was safe. Daniel had quietly arranged for her to travel to New Orleans the previous night, a day earlier than planned, and she was already resting in a private residence 2 blocks from the venue. But the walls were closing. Roman spent 4 hours on the phone with 3 lawyers and an emergency power contractor. Claire simultaneously worked her media contacts, not just for coverage, but for protection. She understood instinctively what Roman was learning quickly. The best shield against powerful men with legal teams was an audience too large to ignore. The moment enough people were watching, certain moves became impossible. She published a preliminary piece at 2 p.m. Thursday. Not everything, just enough. Victor Dane's name. The contract structure. A summary of what Evelyn had told her in the desert room, carefully verified against the documents they'd assembled. 2 other former Dane artists, emboldened by something they couldn't quite name yet, agreed to be quoted by name within an hour of publication. The injunction quietly disappeared by 4 p.m. The power was restored by 6. Friday arrived the way important days sometimes do, ordinary on the surface until you looked directly at it. Roman stood backstage at the Marichal Room at 7 p.m., watching the seats fill through a gap in the curtain. The venue held 300 people. There were twice that many outside on the street. A live-stream countdown was running on screens across 4 platforms. Percy was running the band through a final quiet rehearsal on stage, his trumpet muted, the sound barely carrying. Daniel appeared beside Roman without announcement. They stood together watching the stage, not speaking, until Daniel said, "She asked if you'd check on her." Roman found Evelyn in the small backstage dressing room, seated at a vanity mirror, dressed simply in dark blue with her silver hair down for the first time since he'd known her. She looked at his reflection when he came in. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," she said without embarrassment. "I haven't performed for an audience in 30 years. My heart is genuinely misbehaving." She said it lightly, but Roman caught the specific meaning in it. He pulled a chair close. "Evelyn, I know what the doctor said." She met his eyes in the mirror. "I also know I have 41 songs that nobody has ever heard, and a man who stole them is dying and trying to take them permanently with him." She straightened slightly. "I'm not leaving before the music does." Roman said nothing because there was nothing to say that she hadn't already said better. He went back to the door and nearly walked directly into Daniel, who had apparently followed him down the corridor and been standing just outside the room. "Go in," Roman said quietly. Daniel looked at the door. "She won't want. She asked me to check on her," Roman said. "I think she meant you." Daniel was still for a long moment. Then from inside the room came Evelyn's voice, not performing, not projecting, just singing softly to herself, barely audible through the door. A simple melody. Gentle and very old. Daniel's expression changed completely. Something in his face broke open and then reassembled into something softer and much younger than his years. "That's the lullaby," he said. Almost to himself. "She used to." He stopped. Roman stepped aside. Daniel pushed the door open and went in, and Roman walked back toward the stage without looking back, because some moments are not meant for witnesses. At 8 p.m., Evelyn Hart walked out of the wings and into the light, and 300 people inside the marital room and several 100,000 people watching screens around the world went completely, absolutely silent. Percy raised his trumpet. And she began. She opened with something nobody recognized. That was the first surprise. The audience had come expecting the classics, the album tracks they'd grown up with, the songs that had soundtracked marriages and funerals and long drives and quiet heartbreaks across 3 decades. They were prepared to be nostalgic. They were not prepared for something entirely new, which turned out to be infinitely more devastating. The song had no title yet. Evelyn had written it somewhere between Chicago and New Orleans, in the back of a car or a train or a borrowed room. She told Roman she couldn't remember exactly where, only that it arrived the way her best songs always had, fully formed and slightly urgent, like it had been waiting for the right moment to insist on existing. It was about hiding. Not metaphorically. Literally. The specific texture of a life lived in other people's shadows, in rooms that weren't yours, under names that didn't fit. The loneliness of safety. The strange grief of surviving something that was designed to erase you. She sang it without dramatics, without the theatrical emotion that lesser performers used to signal to an audience how they were supposed to feel. She simply sang it, and the room figured out how to feel entirely on its own. By the second verse, people were crying who hadn't expected to. By the end of the song, nobody was speaking. Percy brought his trumpet in on the final note, a single, sustained tone that rose slightly at the end like a question, and then the room erupted. Not immediately. There was a delay of several seconds, a collective held breath, before the applause came, and when it came it was the kind that has physical weight. Evelyn stood in the light and let it land. She performed 9 songs in total. 6 from the secret New Jersey sessions, raw and brilliant, and nothing like the polished productions of her earlier albums. 2 older pieces reimagined so completely they sounded like new compositions. And 1 near the end, that she introduced by simply saying into the microphone. "This one was stolen from me. I'd like it back." The crowd understood. Between the 7th and 8th songs she spoke. She didn't use notes. She stood at the microphone and told the audience what had happened to her with the same directness she'd used in the desert room in Santa Fe, only now 300 people and several 100,000 screens were receiving it. She named Victor Dane clearly and without hesitation. She described the contracts in specific language. She explained what coercion looks like when it's dressed in the clothing of opportunity, how it arrives as a hand extended in your direction and only later reveals itself as a leash. She was not angry. That was the second surprise. She was something more powerful than angry. She was clear, precise and certain and completely unafraid, speaking with the authority of a woman who had already lost the thing people usually spend their lives trying not to lose and had discovered, on the other side of that loss, that she was still entirely herself. Claire was live streaming from the sound booth, feeding the performance to every platform simultaneously while her written piece, the full investigation, now complete, now including everything, published across 2 major outlets at precisely 9 p.m. The timing was deliberate. By the time anyone connected to Victor Dane thought to move legally, the information was already everywhere, splitting and multiplying across the internet with the unstoppable momentum of something true that people had been waiting to hear. By 9:30, 3 more former Dane artists had posted public statements. By 10, a federal entertainment attorney announced on social media she was opening a pro bono case on behalf of affected artists. By 10:15, Victor Dane's eldest son released a statement through a publicist that described the evening as a publicity stunt by a troubled woman. It was ratioed into irrelevance within minutes. The Dane family's empire, built across 40 years of silence and intimidation, began coming apart in an evening, not with a dramatic explosion but with the quiet, irreversible logic of a structure whose central support had finally been removed. Evelyn sang her final song at 10:40 p.m. Roman watched from the wings. Beside him, without having planned to be there, stood Daniel, hands clasped in front of him, jaw tight, watching his mother stand in the light with an expression that had moved entirely beyond the reach of words. The last song was the lullaby. She hadn't announced it. She simply began, unaccompanied, no band, no trumpet, just her voice in the room. And because it was simple and ancient and private, it hit harder than anything else she'd sung all evening. Roman heard someone in the front row audibly break. He felt something shift in his own chest, something that had been tightly wound for weeks slowly, carefully releasing. Beside him, Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite anything, not a sob, not a word, something in between that belonged to no category except its own specific grief and love and the impossible complexity of forgiving someone not because what they did was acceptable but because the alternative was carrying it forever. When the song ended, Evelyn stepped back from the microphone. She found Daniel in the wings with her eyes, across the distance of the stage, and held his gaze for a long moment. He didn't move toward her. He didn't need to. Something passed between them that required no movement, and no words and had been 30 years in transit. Then she walked off stage. She collapsed 40 minutes later. Backstage, quietly, between one breath and the next, sitting in the chair in the dressing room where Daniel and Roman and Claire had gathered around her naturally, without anyone suggesting it. Her heart, which had been misbehaving for months and had apparently decided to hold on through sheer stubbornness until it had no remaining reason to, simply stopped fighting. The paramedics arrived quickly. They were kind and professional and ultimately unnecessary. She died as she had lived for the past 30 years, surrounded by people who had chosen, without obligation, to love and protect her. The difference was that this time she knew they were there. This time she wasn't hidden. The months that followed moved the way grief does, unevenly, with unexpected moments of lightness breaking through the weight. Claire's investigation won 2 major journalism awards and triggered a congressional hearing on predatory contracts in the music industry. 4 artists recovered their masters. Legislation was proposed. It was slow and imperfect and real, which was the only way anything important ever actually changed. Daniel returned to New Orleans. He started a small music foundation in Evelyn's name. Nothing grand, just a space where young artists could record without signing anything that would outlast the session. He called Roman occasionally, always briefly, always about logistics, never about feelings, which Roman understood was its own kind of closeness. Roman transformed the Mirage Crescent. Not immediately and not without difficulty, but methodically, the way his father would have done it, one decision at a time, each one building towards something that couldn't be mistaken for anything other than what it was. The third floor was repurposed entirely. Room 309 became the centerpiece of a permanent exhibition on overlooked American musical artists, its walls lined with photographs and handwritten sheet music and vinyl records donated by musicians across the country who had heard about Evelyn and recognized something of themselves in her story. The lounge stayed a lounge. But the menu changed, each cocktail named after a musician who had been forgotten too soon. It became, unexpectedly, the most written about bar in Las Vegas, for reasons that had nothing to do with the drinks. Claire moved to Las Vegas on a Tuesday in November, arriving with 2 suitcases and the particular energy of someone who had already decided and wasn't interested in making a ceremony of it. Roman met her in the lobby. She looked at the exhibition space through the glass doors and was quiet for a moment. "She'd have hated the fuss," Claire said. "Probably," Roman agreed. "She'd have loved the attention." Claire laughed, sudden and real, the laugh she had when something caught her off guard. Roman had come to understand it was the most honest thing about her. They opened the Evelyn Hart archive 6 months later, 41 songs, fully produced with Percy's band, released without label involvement, available everywhere, free to stream. In the first week it became the most listened to jazz album in a decade. Critics ran out of adequate language and eventually settled for describing the experience of hearing it as something close to receiving a letter that had been lost in the mail for 30 years. Which was, Roman thought, exactly what it was. He stood in room 309, now a room of photographs and music and carefully preserved memory, on the evening of the archive's release, listening to Evelyn's voice come through the small speaker someone had installed near the window. Outside, Las Vegas performed its nightly spectacle, indifferent and blazing and eternal. Inside, the voice filled the room the way it always had. Like it had never left. Like it had simply been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for the world to finally quiet down enough to hear it.